Hello and welcome back to another exciting week of the War Report. And yeah, this week took quite an unexpected turn. It seems like the world is just on fire, and more so than usual. Now, granted, this doesn't have the same doom and gloom feel of even mid 2018, spring 2018, but I wouldn't even say it's anywhere close. But it's definitely quite the show, especially with our news in Syria, which we'll be starting out with. So our audience here will be able to see the map. Now, of course, there's been the skirmishes in northern Turkey, northern Syria with Turkey. There was actually a joint SDF and Syrian army operation against Turkish-backed forces in northern Syria. Uh, you can see they've actually updated the map where it's a bit of an orange color, where Manbij is actually shown under a joint occupation of the SDF and Syrian forces. The usual activity in Idlib. I think something you may be able to back this up. Wasn't something Russia said we've done 1,000 strikes on Idlib since we've gotten involved in the war?
Right. I just, if people thought that Syria was complicated last year, they're in for a surprise. And again, Russia's managed to kind of play both sides. We're seeing, Kurds attacking convoys of Turkish and Russian patrol vehicles in the north. There's been a few incidences, but no light arms exchange or anything like that. These are people throwing, literally rocks and garbage with Western media that happens to be always there. And so I do find it interesting that on the one hand, Kurds are attacking the Russian convoys along with the Turkish convoys, and at the same time they're fighting alongside Assad against Turkish-backed forces. And I mean, the message that I heard from Russia is that um, Turkey is going to resume their war efforts eventually, and Kurds will have to deal with it. But I find that interesting how that will shoehorn Assad into this.
Oh yes.
In
Now,
that, what are his like? What's his? I mean, I don't think he has a game plan, to be honest, because in a sense he's lost control of the country, more or less. He does maintain some control. I think if Assad was absent, we would still get a very different world. We would get perhaps even an uprising. Uh, Presumably, if Assad in uh, weren't in charge to some extent in Syria, um, there could even be an uprising or a backlash against Russia, because then, of course, it would be all too plain that the country has been lost to the great powers, as it were. So this is a very difficult situation. I don't know how Russia is going to navigate this, or Assad and Syria are going to navigate this. I think this is by far the most complicated war I have ever, ever encountered. Um, what what presumably is going to happen when and if Turkey resumes its war efforts? Are you know where how what kind of coordination is there going to be between Russia and Syria? I think you know we're entering some murky ground now.
yeah, I think just building on your previous statement, it's fair to say that Assad controls everything west of the Euphrates, but east of there, in that yellow, in that weird mix of color you can see on the map, it's anyone's game.
I know, but I mean, in terms of popular support for the Syrian who supported Assad or has come around to support Assad, or at least wants the territorial integrity of Syria maintained. Um, what are their feelings? How are they going to respond to this, right? Because eventually you see a clash here, right? Like you could argue. that the Kurds becoming more visibly upset in the north is going to, of course, work for the benefit of America and Israel, and maybe one or two of the Gulf states, although they don't seem all that interested anymore, and you know they're preoccupied with Yemen. But um, so is a pretext to America repositioning its troops from eastern Syria back into northern Syria, because of course America technically never left Syria. How is that going to work out? I do think some of these garbage and rock throwing at patrol vehicles is definitely staged. Like, it's definitely, that isn't to minimize their emotions. I think Kurds are very upset, but there's no question that they're coordinating this with media in order to show disaffection and encruntlement over what has transpired and so on, right? Like, we've had a lot of instances where America is going to leave Afghanistan and so on. So, anyways, it makes this war very complicated. I think the complexity of this war is only going to increase in the next 2-3 weeks. There's still a lot of unfinished business. There's nowhere near beginning, this ambitious Turkish idea of resettling Syrian refugees back in the north. These would be refugees who are actually not Kurds and may even well have been, but probably it's only a small number. Those Arab minorities in the north that fled the war, that also fled Kurdish forces, because we know the Kurds also ethnically genocided certain villages and got them to leave. So it's going to get very, very complicated, and I don't know if how this is going to be a remedy going forward. You're seeing very small powers that are in this process of balkanization, and throughout Middle Eastern history, there's been moments where these people have been under different empires, whether that was under a caliphate, whether that was under the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, one of the European powers like France, and so on, right? And they have these, some of them have nationalistic aspirations, like the Kurds. And I think the Kurds are optimistic because they see themselves as a necessity to Israeli and American power in the Middle East, right? That is what spurs them on. But even America's hands are a bit tied because, of course, America needs Turkey to check on Russia from the south and so on.
Yeah, and of course the internal strife of American foreign policy with the hard non-interventionists, which are few and far in between, the Trump types, who I would call them half-ass non-interventionists, and then of course the neocons, the war hawks, the usual suspects in Washington D.C. But I think you make a lot of great points, and I could see what is happening in Syria. Syria is similar to what's happening in Ukraine. It seems to be this new Russian strategy where they push for federalization in countries they want influence over. They push to weaken their central governments. For example, again, Russia has been more or less cooperative with the Kurds, on and off, depending on the situation. They've called for referendums in Ukraine. It's a strategy when there's an uncooperative nation or uncooperative elements in a
Yeah,
nation. I mean,
yeah.
it's frankly,
It'll be interesting to see how well that goes.
yeah, I mean, it's frankly ingenious, especially compared to American and Western ideas at dominating countries where it's either just brute force or color revolution, where Russia actually plays into the internal politics of a country and shifts them to their favor. Now, of course, many people would like to think that they did the exact same thing in the United States, despite not having anywhere close to the resource that they need. I mean, they do this to second and third world countries. Come on, yeah, they can do Syria and Ukraine. Wow, the United States is really on par with Syria and Ukraine. Now, give it 20 years, that may be the case, but beyond that, it's ridiculous. Yeah, but that's all I had to say on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have other than the border, I don't have too much to add for that area of Syria.
But oh
However,
boy, we have another area of
but
Syria, as you can probably see right here on the
yes,
map.
that's right. And this is Damascus we're talking about. And it's probably related, as you were saying off air, that this could involve this brand new Islamic group called Islamic Jihad, which is a bit of a redundant name, but
Yeah, which
apparently a
we discussed last
Palestinian
week.
Jihad group. What's that?
We discussed it last week. We went into this a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess just to recap, this is a Palestinian group in Syria fighting along with Assad forces and other forces, loyal to Assad and Iran, more important. But yes, so looks like they might have been attacked just outside of Damascus by Israeli jets. I'm hearing 4 or 5 missiles were launched by the Israelis, and 2 were taken out by the Syrian government. And this comes on the heels of 4 missiles that were launched into the Golan Heights. So apparently, this is a retaliation.
Yeah, which of course the missiles fired in the Golan Heights were from the missiles fired yesterday into Syria. And again, I don't think this is like 2018. I don't think this is like April, May 2018, where it's the proper Syrian government fighting with Israel. I think that's pretty much been put to rest by Russia, by the greater powers, and through negotiations towards a shaky but stable peace deal. Again, it had to be one of the militant groups, whether that was Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whether that was Hezbollah, probably not Hamas. Again, Israel has been reluctant to touch Hamas in Syria, as we were touching on last week. Nothing to see there. Of course not. Again, but that's aside the point. But 2 things I can say for sure about Israel launching these strikes on Syria, or on at least groups in Syria. Number one is that I believe they have had to form a new government at this point. There has to be a new stable government if they're taking this sort of military action, because again, if Netanyahu's position as prime minister is threatened, and he takes military operation, which could end disastrously, he's risking his own power. So unless he's secure in his power, he's not going to take any big risks like that. Thing number 2 is that whether it's Netanyahu, whether it's Gantz, no matter who's in charge of Israel, even though I can say with almost certainty it's Netanyahu, is that they're not satisfied with recent U.S. actions in the region. You see this, it's an inverse relationship. The less America does in the Middle East, specifically Syria, specifically that region of the Middle East, the more Israel does. Now, not only to pick up the slack for Americans, quote unquote, but more to send a message to Washington saying, you should be doing this. What's going on? Why have you lessened your commitment to this theater of war? So, those are the 2 main conclusions I draw away from that. Now, again, we still haven't gotten confirmation on who exactly Israel is bombing, but like I said, if I had to take a guess, probably like last week, and probably the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Israel could be targeting other groups. I mean, Israel would be just as happy to take out Assad, regardless what the consequences might be. So they're more than happy to, perhaps, if it becomes clear which group sent these missiles into Syria, to obfuscate that and make it seem like it was maybe one of a unit belonging to the Syrian army. The thing is that Syria is like I was saying earlier, just one of the most complicated battlefields anyone could imagine. It really is, in many respects, a kind of no man's land, even in areas that seem routine. That, in a sense, is itself a kind of simulacrum, because you have, I mean, we've gone over this before, but you have Iranian forces, you have like a dozen jihadi forces. Now we have a new one that is Shia instead of Sunni. Russians, Turks, Turkmen, like the list goes on. Whatever amount of foreign fighters are left.
Well,
This
let me
growing.
just read what's here on the map. So, for the for the red, it's government and pro-government forces: Assad, Russia, Iran. The rebels include groups such as Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, etc., and more radical groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as al-Nusra, the Islamic State. The Kurds, which include the YPG, PKK, Peshmerga, SDF, which itself is made up of several groups, the Golan Heights, which are controlled by Israel, and FSA-aligned groups that are allied with Turkey in northern Syria. So, just to put that in perspective, that's far from everyone involved.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a, a very very complicated situation, and there's all kinds of cover that various factions could blame other groups and so on. So, but this has happened, and it doesn't seem like Israel's attacks were all that effective, notwithstanding the hit last week on the leader of Islamic Jihad that was taken out. Frankly, I don't even know what this group is doing in Syria. Like, my own personal belief is they're not helping. Their own people are in tremendous difficulty and hardship. They're not. Are they really needed in Syria?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, considering the fact it's the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Palestinian being the key word there, you figure, I mean, and you could say the same about a group like Hamas. Like, you're supposed to be this great resistance against Israel, yet in a roundabout way, I mean, this isn't as true for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad as it is for Hamas. In a roundabout way, you're helping Israel in Syria.
yeah. I mean, I'm very sure that at least once they've been in a situation where they've probably fought against Palestinians, the Sunni Palestinians that have joined the cause against Assad. I don't know what kind of like this is this is pointless. It's because this will only create more division within the Palestinian community
And
in Israel.
I'm glad you
So
bring that up because that is on top of the United States overwhelmingly Congress passes a resolution saying we have no problem with Jewish settlements in the West Bank.
right, yeah, exactly, yeah, that was very very disappointing. Uh, I'm very sure Trump is doing this to garner support for the 2020 election. You know, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just gave all this land to Israel. I just said it's okay for Israel to steamroll officially over the Palestinians instead of unofficially.
Yeah, of
You
course. I
also,
mean, it'll be funny watching the Democrats weasel around that because it was overwhelming bipartisan support. Like the usual holdouts were there, the people who abstained from their votes, and I'm going to be interested, like with the Democratic base, especially in the primaries, where they want the further left, more pure Democratic policies. Like, I want this brought up at the next Democratic primary debate. What's your opinions on the recent move? Do you agree with your Democratic counterparts that these settlements are legal, that these Israeli settlements are legal? And you'll get the ones who dance around it. You'll get, of course, the ones who are unabashedly saying, "Oh no, this is terrible, free Palestine, etc." But it'll still be interesting to see where, especially the front runners, fall on this. And I think I have my ideas, but I'll hold back on those.
yeah. So, you know, this this for me is a very very sort of ego driven an idealistic approach. This isn't going to weaken Israel. This is only going to help Israel. It's only going to give Israel more reasons to attack Syria carte blanche and claim that they're going after Islamic Jihad or what have you. We've noticed in the past that the more successful. Remember when Syria was really cleaning up that southern part of Syria that borders on Israel near the Golan Heights. I mean, there were Islamic groups that were being destroyed and rushing across the border into Israel and Jordan and whatnot. And Israel attacked because they even attacked the Russians in that area. So. You know,
but I think Israel has accepted that they've that their interests, by and large, have failed in Syria, and there's no need to keep Israel involved because uh, Israel can always play the card, that they're the one democracy in the whole of the Middle East, being surrounded by vicious Arabs who all want them to die, and so on. So that's all I pardon me that I have to say about that group.
Yeah, I would say pretty much you're spot on about that. But I do think it's interesting that the most significant strike we get in Syria in months isn't even targeted at the Syrian government or even a significant pro-Iranian group. At this point, I think it boils down to more of the Israel-Palestine conflict and how much of a corner Israel's backed itself in that they're just going to attack pro-Palestinian groups. Now, I don't think it'll go this far, but again, like when are they going to attack Hamas in Syria? Now, I think things are going to have to get pretty desperate before anything like that ever happens. But that's all the news I have for Syria. Now, moving on from Syria to the debacle in Iran. So Iran is in another wave of protests. They always seem to happen around this time of year for obvious reasons. Now, in the wake of them discovering a massive oil field, which they say will increase their production by 15 to 30%, different figures thrown around, the Iranian government raises fuel prices, which of course sends the people into demonstrations, into violent demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. I mean, even one of their branches of the central bank of Iran was burned down, which is a bit funny because a lot of people on there were like, "Oh, I guess we got to bomb Iran now. They burned down their bank." Now, one thing you got to remember, just as a side note, the Iranian central bank isn't tied to the Western ones. It's pretty independent. And some could argue that that's one of the reasons why the West is going so hard against them, whether that's through a more Trumpian strategy, putting sanctions on them, threatening war, or through the Obama-Clinton strategy, where it's like, oh, we're going to cozy up to you, we're eventually going to economically consume you and bring you into the Western economic sphere, and you're just going to be another Saudi Arabia. Now, these protests, a lot of people are trying to make it out as more like, oh, they're protesting the repressive government and religious authoritarianism, when it's pretty clear that they're just pissed off about fuel prices. It's something you can relate to from the United States to France, which, speaking of which, we're about on the 1 year anniversary. I think we're actually just a little bit past of the Yellow Vest protest. Now, that'll be interesting to see how French fuel prices go and whether we'll see a reemergence of those, which we'll get in some European news later. But this is probably the one thing you can do that will create a multilateral front against you. Now, I'm not saying the Iranian government's going to be overthrown by this, but one thing you can do to piss virtually everyone off is raise fuel prices. And I don't know the rationale behind this. I imagine, of course, sanctions are either do have something to do with it or are going to be said to have something to do with it. But it just seems like an odd move of possibly an aged leader, but I don't know. The whole thing strikes me as odd. I don't think it's entirely like a color revolution type thing, CIA backed up, but again, it's all very odd.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I think the CIA is permanently in Iran. They have groups that they're, of course, interested in supporting, obviously. But you know, is this serious? We had the other revolution about potential the thought revolution in in Iran about 2 years ago, where the women were going to overthrow everything, and
Yeah, and
you had
how inconspicuously
Middle
was
East.
just upper class women, all from urban areas, not like anyone in the rural parts. Even most of the city women was like, okay, what's going? Again, just like pretty much like again, I suppose you could say Iranians aren't white, but pretty much just the liberal woman revolution that was supposed to overthrow the Iranian government.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's I mean, it's a neoliberal wet dream, but I mean, then they have similar wet dreams about Russia as well. So but I do think this is economic. This isn't. They're not going like they're not trying to. There are disgruntled groups. There is a bracket of the youth who don't want the country to be religious and so on. They're always going to maintain there, and Iran has a problem being like a barely over 50%. I think it's 60% majority and Persian majority. So like it doesn't. It's not like it doesn't have its challenges and weak points, but I agree with you. I don't think this is a color revolution. I think that a lot of this is related with the sanctions that were placed on Iran. We were talking about this that they were in the summer that they were coming in November. So, um, and part of this is Iran. Iran wants to manage their presence in Syria. They want to what have you uh, project their power through a group in Israel. I mean I just think sometimes they make very poor moves, as if the Houthis weren't enough of a responsibility. So that's my take on it. I think this is economic.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And just to further on what you're saying, Iran, they are obviously a smart player. They wouldn't be here, at least in the current form, if they were not. But they do have a tendency to overdo it. They have a tendency to stretch themselves thin, as you were saying. Now, another point I will make on that is, look, there is a significant part of the youth that is against the Islamic Republic. But contrary to what the Western media, contrary to what people want you to think, they're not exactly secular Western liberals. Now, yes, they're secularists, but they're more of the like secular nationalist types. I mean, of course, since they're not Arab, it wouldn't be like a Ba'athist party, but it's something akin to that.
yes, yeah, I would agree with that. So yeah, this is um, I don't know what their long game plan is or what they can do. Yeah, I don't, I'm sort of at a loss for words. They could. I mean, there is a potential that they could lose it all. Like, if not now, of course. I don't think that's going to happen now. But 10 years down the road, and you know, large powers plan for this. That if the world continues to change in a certain direction and in a certain trajectory that has been going on, perhaps America's more than willing to slap on more sanctions. You know, and I know now. I know that Instex is a new emerging phenomenon, and there's workaround. But I mean, let's be honest. It's a country that is struggling right now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt about that. And again, even if they stuck with the deal, they're selling themselves to westernization. They're opening themselves up to Western markets, and again, like I said, pretty much becoming a second Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a bit of a long stretch here. This is a bit looking far into the future, about a decade or so. But I think we're starting to see the foundation of this being built. I wouldn't say a civil war is on the brink in Iran, not even close. But you're seeing this three-way competition for influence over Iran. That you have the Anglo-American sphere, especially with someone like a Boris Johnson in power, which we'll get into the British news here in a couple minutes. They want the regime toppled. They want a completely complicit government. Then you have the Russian and, to an extent, Chinese sphere, where they are fully behind the current regime. They want deals with the Islamic Republic. They want Instex and everything you're mentioning. And then the third is the more French-led European Union bloc that's arising, especially under the leadership of Macron, who is, we want to pander to Iran for, number one, our own interests, keeping fuel price down, keeping myself in power, and number two, to sort of thumb their noses at the U.S. and to a lesser extent Russia and China, where they want to assert themselves as world power, saying we can play with the big boys too. We can have influence over Middle Eastern countries, and I think you're going to see a lot of divides in Iran break down along one of those three lines in the near future.
Hmm. I think that's a great analysis. I would agree with you. Yeah, I mean, there's potential just on the horizon for Iran to really come out of this. And I mean that sincerely. If they can make it for the next 5, 10 years, Iran can be in a very, very different situation.
I mean, they can become what Turkey is now, granted with less sympathy from the U.S., but they can play the world powers if they play their cards right now.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
And I mean, this isn't anything ahistorical. This goes back to the Great Game. This goes back to the rivalry between the British and Russian empires in the mid to late 19th century. This goes back to the 20th century with competition between the British Empire, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union over influence over Persia, which then became Iran. This goes back to the Cold War. So it's not exactly like it. Now, I would say with Turkey, like, again, the Ottoman Empire did sort of play a middleman sometimes, but Turkey's position is relatively new. But putting Iran in this position wouldn't be anything new to them.
Yeah, they've yes, I agree. They've managed this before. So yes, you know, if if they can manage to begin selling their oil through Instex and capitalize on what they've already the new oil findings, because of course a lot of this was spurred because of this enormous tax hike for their fuel. And I willing to bet this is directly related to sanctions. Of course, they're not allowed to sell their oil, so they can't project their financial power and their financial potential because of this. Um, yeah, if that I mean, but how does that come about? I think there has to be, and this is sort of the weak spot that I think uh, Western analysis of the great game being played right now uh, have noted in the past. How strong are Russia's ties to China, China's ties to Iran? Like, how well do they coordinate? I mean, of course, the veneer is that the Western powers coordinate and cooperate smoothly all the time, or almost all the time, with only minor hiccups. Of course, that's not true at all, right? But just look at Nord Stream 2 for an example, or you know Erdogan is still going to buy the S-400 system, just as an example. But for Iran is, I think, a player that uh, has an interest, should be an interest for China and for Russia. Um, I don't think that they're a power that. I think there's overlap. I think there's conflict there, but I think where they're situated, and if we're talking about the projection of one silk, one road, um, some deals should be made with Iran. Like, is it really in China's best interest to see a very weak Iran? Russia doesn't have the potential to move into Iran and Syria at the same time to stabilize the country. I mean, it's stupid, but you can bet that America, through proxies, does have the potential to bring somebody in, or would be more than glad to have it crack and balkanize under ethnic and religious divides. Right. So
With you saying that, and again, maybe I'm projecting a bit too far in the future. That's why I think France and I would say this rebirth of the European Union in some form will be the key player in all this. I think that Iran will really be turning to them in the near future. Not that they don't have these a building relationship with Russia and China. Now that you mention that, you say like, yes, the Western alliance has its faults. So does this burgeoning alliance between Russia, Iran, and China. Well, the difference between those, just real quick, is the Western alliance is dying, while the alliance in the East is being born. That so it's again, one's having its growing pains and one is having its death throes.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, it only makes it only makes sense. A lot of the potential conflicts that could arise, say between Russia, China, Iran, I don't think that time has come. Like, so I think cooperation right now is more important, and I mean, you see this kind of played out, within political movements, that you align with people who are aligned with you against a common enemy, and you hope you can actually solve your differences later after you achieve defeating your enemy. So,
I mean, the cliche example is the U.S. and Soviet Union after World War II. It's like they had a common enemy then, they defeated that common enemy, and then they pointed their daggers at each other. Now, I think there's a semi-comparable situation between the U.S., Iran, Russia, and China dynamic, where yes, these countries have their problems, but they view the U.S. as a greater threat than they view each other as a greater threat. Now, as U.S. power inevitably recedes, will they turn on each other? Again, I think having that discussion now, expecting them to turn on each other tomorrow, is premature. But a decade or two or three down the road might not be too unrealistic. Now, I I take a middle of the road approach where, like, yes, they probably will. It'll probably be a long time of deterioration of the relationship, sort of how we see NATO and the European Union devolving. But I think it will happen eventually, but not at the rate that the Western media and a lot of people who want you to think it is, saying, "Oh, Russia and China, they don't really like each other." Again, they may not. I don't know how these two, and it depends on what factions in power in each country. Putin and Xi Jinping get along very well. They have a very good professional relationship. But again, I mean, Putin will be gone in a couple years. Xi Jinping probably in the next decade or so. You don't know what the new leaders hold. I mean, look at how fast the Soviet Union and China fell out. Using those exact same countries. As soon as Stalin died and Khrushchev took power, you don't know how this is going to go. But again, I think discussing this right now or into the early 2020s is premature and therefore irrelevant.
right. I mean, there's still another 5 years, and judging by the last 5 years, things are moving very, very fast. And what is being invested into is, as you mentioned earlier, a kind of cooperation with Europe in this three that we're talking about. Also, I just want to stress that I'm not in any way, blaming China or blaming Russia for, lack of cooperation and so on. I'm not. I think a lot of this is Iran's circumstances. I think this is something. I think a large part of this is, of course, the failure of the nuclear deal, and had that had gone better, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe Iran's presence in Syria would have diminished. Maybe they don't see a way out because, Iran isn't just in Syria to one day destroy Israel. Like, they're in there because they literally have no defense, and they have no way of, really in time creating a sufficient system to deter a tremendous war that could be brought upon it by Israel and America and Saudi Arabia and what have you. So, it's in their interest. I think they're doing this offensive thing in order to contain them. I just wonder, long term, how long can they sustain this? So that's what I meant about cooperation. I meant more like thinking creatively later. What will these countries do? How are they managing this? Of course, I think it's interesting that since 2015, China has, you hear, of course, China being in the Mediterranean. China, is China going to get involved in Syria? Of course, none of that panned out. And I'm in no way suggesting that, they should have been involved. But I guess what that does is it shows how much China is willing to be on the sideline with some of these things. Granted, though, they're in the early stages of their expansion, with their islands that they're developing and so on. and now they have the Hong Kong riots. So I in no way am lambasting Russia and China. I'm just sort of trying to think creatively how they might think creatively about cooperation in order that Iran doesn't fall, because it will affect them
Yeah, and
tremendously.
arguably, not to drag this on too much, but I can see this at least in the Russian leadership is with their outreach to a lot of these European populists, namely Orban and all his connections, whether that be through Salvini, Le Pen, any of these people. Russia is also, it seems like they have this plan B or possibly plan C in Europe.
Mm. Right, right. But you wouldn't want, like, if you were Russia, even if you integrated well with Europe, let's say in the next 5 years, oil and gas production is moving right along, and nothing is developing in the Caucasus with reference to Azerbaijan. Romania's oil fields are still, not doing anything, and so on. And there's no other alternative forms that can reliably deliver energy to Europe. Just from a geopolitical standpoint, you don't want a broken Iran, or an Iran that becomes hostile to Russia.
Oh, absolutely not.
On the southern flank, because then, of course, that's going to make an impact on it'll be a source of influence for both Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and so on, and Uzbekistan that do border or are close to Russia.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, we were going through a pretty basic history of Iran in the past couple centuries, and that's been one thing that even, whether that be the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, modern Russia, that's one thing they did not want: a hostile Iran, a hostile, I suppose it was Persia then, but it's one thing they've always hedged against. And no matter how many outreaches they make to Europe or China or any other country, they want to keep their southern flank, which is Iran, and now we're seeing this grow with Turkey as well. They want to keep that at least at bay, and would preferably want a productive relationship with those countries. But that's all I had to say on that topic before I move into European news, unless you have anything else here.
No, that's it for me too.
So the big news out of Europe is the UK leadership debates for today, and the way the British media does this, for whatever reason, is they only take the top two frontrunners, and that, of course, was Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party and Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party. Now, I don't think either of them did particularly well in this debate. I don't know how much you watched of it, but
I didn't get a chance.
Corbyn looked disheveled. He looked like he just rolled out of bed. His glasses were all crooked. Boris Johnson looked like the dollar store brand of Trump that he usually does, and about half the debate was focused on Brexit. Now, I would give that half to Johnson hands down, because even though they pressed him on the thing like, oh, you said you were going to get us out on the 31st and you didn't, he pretty much, admitted, like, yeah, I was wrong. But he was strongly like, yes, we're going to leave. Yes, I have a deal planned. Corbyn's main points was like, look, this deal is going to take 7 years to make, which I didn't fact check. I don't know how valid that is, but I would say it's a solid comeback. It's like, do you really have this deal planned? Do you really have the finer details worked out? Do you really do you want to sell our country to the United States? That was another big one that came up, especially with the healthcare. But Corbyn, he was wishy-washy. He was really, he really reflected the divide in the Labour Party. Whether, like, do we remain? Do we leave? Do I call for a second referendum? What do we do? And Johnson pushed him on this. The host, which I don't know the name of, pushed him on this, saying, "Look, just pick one." Now, the second half of the debate was based on the usual issues: social spending, austerity, the things that are usually talked about in British politics. And I would give that. I would say it's a draw. And if I had to pick a winner, I would say slightly Corbyn. Now, according to the British public, this is from a YouGov poll, on who were performing the best on the ITV debate, 51% of the audience said Boris Johnson, while 49% said Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that's probably the smallest margin I've seen for a debate in the Western world. Like, even in the U.S. presidential debate, there's usually a decisive winner. They'll say who it is. They'll say who it is in the leadership debate. Like, for example, I think somehow, some way, Theresa May still managed to outdo Jeremy Corbyn in one of them, but I think Corbyn held his own in the 2017 debates. But right here, again, like, looking at both of them, I thought, like, this is terrible, yet I had the simultaneous feeling of I can understand why someone would vote for either of them.
Right, and I don't think either of them are persuasive figures in terms of leadership. I think uh, they both have this kind of dishevelment about them. That isn't necessarily confidence building, of course. I mean, modern democracies are so much about the image and will always be going forward. So I think maybe I get the sense that there's a kind of enthusiasm without a kind of real enthusiasm about where things are going. I don't think either of these leaders are particularly charismatic. I think Corbyn has a niche group that is always going to support him, but I'll refrain from calling it fringe. I don't think it's fringe, but I think it's a niche group. And my feelings are that he looks to me like an amiable man, but I can see why, say, other voters, other types would look at him and say, no, this is not prime minister material. Whereas maybe with Johnson, there's maybe for all the wrong reasons, as it were, he could be prime minister because he exudes more of a cutthroat. And more of, has just slightly more thuggish, well, not slightly, but a lot more thuggish persona about him. And, the impression that you get with Corbyn is that he can debate and reason his way and achieve something. While that's appealing, I think, for, the way we think about, let's say, highly liberal democracies in highly developed countries, this older psychology that I'm talking about still persists. That will never go away. Maybe the closest that ever came about was, with Obama, but again, with Obama, a lot of it was because how disastrous George Bush Jr. was, and he was running against McCain, and incumbent presidents are more likely to be reelected anyway. So,
yeah, and again, in terms of believability on who you could actually see as prime minister, yeah, Boris Johnson has the advantage of having at least been there for a few months, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been a reality at least for some time. Now, I would say arguably more interestingly, I saw some of the they did interviews, a sit down, a one-on-one with each of the minor party candidates. Now that included the Green Party, Brexit, Lib Dems, and SNP. I only saw the Lib Dems and SNP. Now, the Liberal Democratic leader, Joe Swinson, I think that's her name, gave the pretty trite, I'm going to be the centrist candidates. Boris Johnson's too far right. Jeremy Corbyn's too far left. Why can't they just pick someone sane and rational and reasonable like me? And that was her entire shtick. She was going on about, like, oh, yes, it's so terrible. We need to come back to the center. We need to all just get along and agree on things. And she, again, refused to give an answer on break. She didn't give a solid answer. But one of the most telling things that at least showed the mindset of the sort of centrist liberal mind in the Western world at large is she was asked by the interviewer, you become prime minister. Who is the first world leader that you call? And she said she would call the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I can't remember what her name is. It's some, I think, Kiwi name, but the point stands is that's how out of touch she is. She wants to, like, here's a strong, powerful woman who leads a country, and she'd be just like me. Now, in my mind, there's only two acceptable answers to the question she was asked. Now, I don't know whether they asked the other people. They didn't ask Sturgeon this. They may have asked Farage this and the Green Party leader this. But the only two acceptable answers in my mind are, number one, I would say probably more appropriately for the state of the UK right now, Emmanuel Macron. Number two, if not Macron, Donald Trump. Anything other than that, I think if I were a British voter, I would find absolutely unacceptable.
Right, because that's not somebody who's engaging in real politics. And I know, um, like there's a very strong contingent of voters who don't like the idea of real politics, and I would argue that that you could look at the moral signaling that happens with these election run-ups is in itself realpolitik, so much as it highlights the dominant narrative of what a modern neoliberal democracy is supposed to be. So of course she's going to say New Zealand because of course New Zealand has this great leader who dealt wonderfully with the attack on the mosques in New Zealand back in April and so on. And so that, and it's so that's kind of an emotional appeal rather than a logical one. But New Zealand, I agree with you. What does New Zealand have to do with this? Like, what are you signaling? That white extremists in Britain are going, like, it's ridiculous. So yeah, in terms of realpolitik, yeah, you should be phoning Macron or Trump, because that's the pace of things. That's where the main challenge is, and striving for power is occurring right now.
Yeah, again, like, even if she said Putin or Xi Jinping, like, I think that's still less relevant to the Brexit question, but it's at least the leader of a major country, you could make an economic deal with, especially going into Brexit, leaving the European Union. But again, in my mind, either Macron or Trump. If he's even, I would say even Merkel with her lame duck term would be unacceptable. Any other European leader besides Macron, because he's sort of the face of the European Union now, I would have found unacceptable. And frankly, even as an American who has no say in this political system, I do find unacceptable.
Right. You can see how if he had chosen Putin or Jinping, that would have been very loaded. But there's something very sobering and not very loaded about, say, choosing Macron. I think he's ultimately like the person, any new leader should be voting after the election. It just, that's what makes sense.
Now, moving on from that, moving on to Macron. Again, the same article, the same interview that we keep on bringing up, keeps on getting brought up by the media. Now they have termed his rejection of countries like Albania and Bosnia, which again I'll also get into a little tidbit about that, as it's Islamophobic that he doesn't want these countries in the EU because they're Muslim countries, and even they went to Macedonia, which has the now significant Albanian Muslim minority population, and he's saying, it's Islamophobic because he wants to reject these countries, and he wants to reach out to Russia, which is a white Christian nation, and it's clear that this secular former banker is trying to build this like coalition of European Christendom somehow, but they keep on hammering it for this, which means that it's probably pretty impactful. Now, I think we have seen. I think our audience has seen it, but I think now the general public is starting to see the impact that this one man, who we thought was going to be a dud just a year ago, has made on global politics.
I know, and we are approaching we already surpassed the 1-year anniversary of the Yellow Vests. The last 4 have been about as violent as the protest that started it all off a year ago. And he is, I never thought in my life I would say he's still trudging along. What a trooper. But that is the case. I'm sure like you, I was never a fan of Macron. In many ways, I'm not. And in many ways, he's reacting right now. Macron was a fairly new leader when all of that happened in 2018. And I think he's enormously pragmatic. I think his statement that he didn't want North Macedonia and Albania to ascend into the EU because Bosnia, in his mind, is a powder keg, um, is reasonable. And when people try to counter that, well, France had a lot more, ISIS fighters or people joining ISIS than Bosnia did. Well, let's not forget that Al Qaeda's first home in Europe was in Bosnia, and that they still have a very small presence there. But let's not forget that it was there in the 90s and even in the 2000s, and I think his feeling that bringing Albania, although God, what would Albania contribute?
Migrant labor.
And kidneys. that joke.
No, of course I do.
The Albanian girl. No, what was it? I stole the Albanian girl's heart, but she stole my kidney. Terrible. Okay, sorry, Albanian listeners, but yeah, So yeah, he's of course the virtue signaling, the moralism, that we've all become very accustomed to in the last 5 years, about Islamophobia. I don't think they hold as much water. People don't care that France had more people joining ISIS than Bosnia, because the vast majority of those people who joined them are not French. They're Middle Eastern or North African descent.
Yeah, they're Algerian
that's
migrants or children of Algerian migrants.
Right, or they're Moroccan, or they're from somewhere else, but they're not French. So, yeah, that's why he can't afford it. And we've discussed this before. How well can the EU manage this rapid growing pace? And I think it's kind of like what I was saying about Iran. How far can it extend its power in order to survive? This is another example of like the ties, the sort of like, how can I put it? There isn't entrenched the kind of social and institutional narrative in the EU that is substantial enough that it can maintain this rapid pace.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
Technically, we're on the eve of Brexit. They're not losing Lithuania, right? They're not losing, even like Portugal would be a bigger deal than like losing Lithuania from the EU. But this is Britain we're talking about. So yeah, so those naysayers can go on and on. I think in many ways they're living in the past. I think they sense that let's say figures like Trump, with all their imperfections that can be argued from both sides of the left and right, that they are not a cause, but rather a symptom of a changing time. So I think Macron is waking up to that.
I think you put that perfectly. And I will say this, going on your comment, you said something I frankly agree with, that I'm not a fan of Macron and a lot of what he does. And we may deviate here, but I feel the same way about Macron and France right now as I do about Xi Jinping in China. Not that I necessarily like the leader or am a big fan of what the country does, but I can respect them from the point of view that they're returning the world to a more stable multipolar state, regardless of my personal feelings on their countries and their leadership. Now, what I bring up here on the screen is a 2018 poll of approval of American world leadership in Europe. Now, I'll only do the major ones, but the only country with only two, polities, I'll say, with positive reviews of U.S. leadership is number one with Albania with 80 to 84%, and Kosovo with 80 to 84%, and Albania with 65 to 79% approval of American leadership. Now, Russia is down to 10 to 14, along with Turkey. The Scandinavian states, including Norway and Sweden, are there, even Austria, Portugal. And then in the mid tier are countries like they have about a 25 to 29% approval of American leadership is France, the UK, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, some of these other more Central Asian countries. Uh, they have again a slightly higher view on American leadership than, for example, Russia or Turkey does. Now, the Scandinavian states, I'm a little bit surprised by. Germany is down to the 15 to 19% range. There with Bulgaria and Spain and some of these other countries that have gotten screwed over by the EU, which is it's a bit of a strange dynamic. Serbia, actually, again, I expected Serbia to be in the dark right up there with like Russia and Turkey, but I suppose there's a small liberal holdout, and the most positive country that isn't blue is Poland for obvious reasons. They're at about a 45 to 49% rate. Italy is higher than I expected with about a 40 to 44% rate. Granted, that's dropped off in previous years. They're around the same with Georgia, even though Georgia is sort of at a midway between Italy and Poland. But it is interesting to see the map is red except one little blotch in the Balkans.
Yeah, I mean, this literally, except for those two, nobody is over 50% approval rating, right? And I think it's also both highlights and obscures why that might be. I think a lot of it is because if you look from 2016 to 2017 and then 2018, you kind of see this massive change beginning to occur already. Another low point was like, I think, 2007 for American approval. Of course, that had a lot to do with the Iraq War. But I would say that after Trump got elected, what you saw was an unhappiness. So I think most, say, populist right-wing people throughout Europe are generally unhappy with America.
Yeah, like as much as they may,
except for the ones that
hand.
have huge antagonisms towards Russia, I
Yeah.
think the vast majority are unhappy with them. And of course, there's also third positionists that want neither, but are still unhappy with America. I think you just have to look at Poland in 2018 to understand what I'm saying. But what you also begin to see is that you have left and right unhappy for very different reasons. And that's important to remember. Because if Trump loses the election and somebody else is in, I think you could see potentially like France, Spain, Britain, Denmark, Sweden, definitely Finland, and so on go more blue. But that still would be unusual. That still will be that in itself is pretty interesting. Why? Because 2020 is going to be quite a bit different than 2016, because I think one of the things that cannot be underestimated now is the kind of growing hate of woke culture, LGBTQ agenda, just the whole global homo phenomenon that really took off from like 2015 onwards.
Yeah, beyond this segment like Northwestern Europe, it's not very popular.
Yeah, I mean, if a Democratic is elected, I mean, do we really think that, like, is Poland going to be happy? Like, because you know what that will mean? That will mean even more pressure of LGBT rights in Poland, not less. Right? So, so you have this right wing, left wing narrative, but you have the overall arching narrative about where American leadership wants to take Europe, and there's disgruntlement from both sides, this disapproval from both.
Now, another interesting little tidbit on the map is that both Crimea and the Donbass are as dark as red as Russia, and it almost looks like they drew them as part of the Russian map. So that's a little interesting thing I saw there. Now,
Yeah. Russia. This is proof positive. Russia did get Crimea back.
Now, another thing I will say about this right here is I got this graph from the liberal resistors on Twitter. Now, of course, it was some of my good old mutuals dunking on them. Thank you very much for that. But it's funny to see how they will blame the absolute state of what we're looking at on this map solely on Donald Trump. Not even George W. Bush, not even the Republicans, Donald Trump himself. And I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that Donald Trump is the same symptom of this map, and he's not the cause of it. He comes from the same place this map does, and not the other way around. He did not cause this map.
Right. Right. Overall, I mean, if anything, there is a, I wouldn't say necessarily mistrust of American leadership, although that is there, but there's a lack of confidence, and that's slightly different. That has a different nuance to it. There's an overwhelming feeling that America can't lead the world anymore.
Yeah, and
Ultimately, that's what people feel. But I would say that that describes mostly people in the center and center right, or cuck right. Um, People further on the extremes have on left or right have never liked America. You'll also notice in the map that in earlier maps, Ukraine was never pale orange or blue in any way at any time ever, like from 2009 to 2018. So this, what's their disapproval? Like, what was it before Maidan? What is it after Maidan? Like, is it Trump? Like this, why certain countries don't like America, first of all, are much deeper. And you can see that there's a kind of blue-red flickering that occurs, but that's in Western Europe, right? That is more tangential to who's president and what the perception of that president is vis-a-vis the media outlets,
yeah,
right? Because of course lefties will forgive Obama, right? But Blumf is unforgivable.
it is interesting to see that where again you'll get these. I suppose France is going in a different direction, but UK, Germany, Spain, etc., where it's like Trump's crass comments are beyond the pale, or Bush's Bushisms and his flubs in his speech are beyond the pale. But you bring up along Obama, it's okay. Whereas you get in this southern Eastern Europe, who have been consistently screwed over by the U.S. at least since the end of the Cold War. They don't care whether you're Democrat, Republican. They have no use for you. Now,
Yeah,
one other thing.
yeah. I mean, you can see it in the Baltic states too. These are states that have a long and complicated and violent history with Russia, and in no way really want to be in Russia's sphere again. But you see, going through the Obama years, the late Bush years, the Trump years, they're constantly one shade of orange or another. They disapprove. Now, like, so what is that? I mean, certainly that's not like Russian minorities in Latvia are doing this. Like, it's ridiculous. They're. This is what I mean about how opinions about America in Europe are going to be very varied because there are so many different countries, right? And it's not just like it's so Western European centric to think like they can figure out why Estonia is still not happy with American leadership, after 10 years.
Yeah, they do like to project like, oh, us enlightened Europeans when again, look, I'm not gonna like completely downplay that there's no connection between Europeans, but you take an Estonian and Englishman, there's a lot they do not have in common. But I will also say this: you brought this up earlier that yeah, even the populist right is growing discontent with the U.S. Now it's strange because you'll see Trump praise them, you'll see them praise Trump sometimes, but you had Orban even as early as 2018 after his election, after the immediate like massive protest after his election, saying, Well, the U.S. is so fickle, you can't trust them because they just have a new leader every 4 to 8 years, and they're just so all over the place. So you're seeing even again these anti-American sentiments from the populist right. Again, Poland is the one exception, which even with this new party rising in Poland that isn't the Law and Justice Party, again they do take third positionists where it's like we want neither the Russians nor the United States or even the Germans, and we want to be Poland. We want Poland. Again, they want to make Poland great again, to borrow an old cliche. But it is interesting again how American liberals, Canadian liberals, and Western European liberals project the very complex history of countries like in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine on Trump's crass comments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I only have the China news to close out with. Now, I'll start out with the non-Hong Kong China news. So, for the first time, I believe, since the inception of the People's Republic of China, since the end of the Chinese Civil War, China has sailed an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait. And they've been increasing their naval operations in the surrounding waters in the South China Sea. The U.S. hasn't issued that many statements of condemnation, hasn't been running that many drills on their own, which I guess you could say is reflective of the internal state of the U.S. But even allies in the region with naval presence in the region, such as Australia, the U.K., even Japan, haven't been running that many naval drills, and they've sort of just let China do what they want and haven't been, again, like sort of tempting them. Believe it or not, the last close call in East Asia was the fact that a Russian destroyer and U.S. destroyer, both in Philippine waters, almost collided. And again, that was aggressive drills on both parts, but it wasn't the U.S. and China going head to head. It was the U.S. and Russia going head to head on that one. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether like Trump is on the verge of some great breakthrough deal with China. That could be it. So he's being a bit more conciliatory towards them, which you could also tie in the Hong Kong thing, if you believe those leaks that Trump sort of swept the Hong Kong thing under the rug in interest of a trade deal. But I would say that's the most likely theory, that especially going into the election, Trump wants to hammer out a deal in these coming months. If, I would say at least in the early months of 2020, before the end of the Democratic primary. So that's something he can campaign on. Look at this great new trade deal with China. So again, I think that could explain the lessened U.S. presence. The U.S. also did, on a side note, call off military drills in South Korea as a gesture towards the North Koreans. So those negotiations exist but are on life support. There hasn't been any really new hostilities between anyone in the Korean Peninsula, whether that be North and South, or U.S. and North Korea, or China getting involved in that. But the Hong Kong protests, the big news I saw there is, okay, they've turned completely into riots. And again, despite my sort of like who cares thoughts on it, because again, it's not really anything I'm compelled by either side. I do respect some of the tactics of the protesters, like them disrupting some of the cameras and stuff. And the one Archer, I'll admit, like that hasn't completely sold me on the Hong Kong protest. I'm not one of these people that are like, I'm not a redditor, to put it simply, but
Yeah.
it's like you look at it and you're like, oh, that's good. Maybe we could use that in a totally hypothetical scenario, because we would never advocate violence on the show. Absolutely not. But it is interesting to see the way things heat up. But the U.S. House and Senate both overwhelmingly passed a bipartisan resolution backing the Hong Kong protest. Now, I don't believe this is out of
Shocking.
any
Absolutely shocking.
yeah.
I did not see that coming.
But beyond, of course, just like the liberal fart huffing that you would expect, I am tempted to also say that they're trying to derail Trump's trade negotiations. I wouldn't put it past them to do that kind of move just out of spite for Trump.
Right. They want to create a wedge in order to set up a new bargaining position. Right. We can help you make these protests go away if you do A, B, and C. It's hard to say, because I think there is an overlap, oddly enough, between Trump's crew and the more liberal or neoliberal branches of the American government and the American establishment. I do think that, like this, if anything, there's more likelihood that they will agree think there are crazies who want Trump to fail on the trade agreement, but I do think that they are both happy about the protests that are happening there. Uh, I think that's something that they can agree on. But yeah, they're getting far more violent now. The restraint that the Chinese government is showing is pretty incredible. Uh, People have been hurt. I believe there's one fatality, but that's still less than what happened in France this 1 year of the Yellow Vest protests. So, make of that what you will. Apparently, I think there's still students, as far as I know, for today that are holed up in the university in Hong Kong. But you're seeing this sort of ground level conflict between civilians now, where there's people trying to clean up the street, and then you have these protesters, and I mean 95% are under 25. For me, like, these are mostly university students, and they're young university students at that. For me, I can't back them. I can't back them because what they want is the kind of poison that is settled into the West. You have protests that not so much now that it's become so violent, but I noticed in the late spring, early summer, protesters dressed up as Harry Potter. Girl camps, these e-thoughts with their porn sites and what have you. The whole slut pride thing. Like, I don't care. I want Beijing to crush them.
I mean, and again, it's such a contrast to the early Hong Kong protests, which were the ones who were like the conservative Christians who were nostalgic about British rule. Like, it's amazing how quickly it devolved and how any degree of it being genuine was so quickly dissipated by liberal infiltrators.
Right, and also a lot of it was because it started as a boomer protest. These were Hong Kong British boomers, who I think are I don't know what's wrong with them. Are they unaware of how different Britain is now, even from '97? Like, where are they? I think they live in Hong Kong. Maybe they visit Britain once in a while. They understand maybe Britain vis-a-vis television, and but they live in a more traditional society in Hong Kong, and just presume. I mean, it's so absurd. So yeah, a boomer right. To me, they remind me of the boomer right, the kind of the alt-right boomer phenomenon in America.
Yeah,
right?
Sort of like the Reagan Thatcher nostalgia sort of crew.
Yeah,
again, think what you will about that, but I can respect them more than I respect again the cam girls dressing up as Harry Potter.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally their kids took over for protesting, and their kids are completely not like them. If they're, you don't want your kids to succeed in this. Trust me.
Yeah, and again, I am going to make a prediction. I'm not saying the Hong Kong protest will dissipate, but I'm saying we'll probably see a major downward trend in activity if an agreement is brokered between the U.S. and China on trade. I think, again, I think a pressure valve will be released if it just so happens that U.S. and China strike a trade deal, and then 3 days later, Hong Kong protesters calm down. Who would have seen anything like that coming?
Right. That would indicate just a level of involvement. I think that's entirely possible. I'll be interested to see who might be funding them. Of course, there are NGOs that have ties to CIA and so on. Nothing new there. One of the things I can't stand is the boomer right in the West. YouTube comments. This is what we gotta do in our own countries. It's like, shut up, sit down, boomer. Like, the reason you're not going to succeed is your young people are doing the same thing, but it's not what is going on is not what you think is going on. Your your kids are in Antifa. Like that, shut up. Like they don't empathize with this. They don't have like, we got to do this. It's like, oh, it's just so sad. Like, I mean, these are the kind of people that like they'll look at Poland, Hungary, and Hong Kong, and they think like they've seen the future, and like they have in some way, like they can't ignore like the Blunt administration like is helping bring gay pride parades, expand them in Poland. Like they can talk about all kinds of nationalist issues and anti-globalization. What difference does it make in the end, right? So I'm always annoyed by by boomers who like right-wing boomers who are all like you know excited about these Hong Kong protests. Maybe that's what we'll do. It's like, no, you won't.
Yeah, and even the funniest thing about that is I pointed this out very early on that there's so little enthusiasm about that, so that even a lot of the boomer right and the alt right, again, they'll say something about it every once in a while, but at the end of the day, it's like they really don't care.
Yeah.
And I think that's a general consensus in the West beyond people. Well, I say the people who care fall into two camps. Either the people who like, haha, take that China, you deal with that thorn in your side, and the camp of the people who buy into the liberal narrative. And neither of which are very very big. And again, like I have my thoughts on China. Pretty middle of the road compared to what a lot of people on the right think. Like either a lot of people are very pro China or very anti China. Again, I think it's more nuanced than that. I've gone into that before. I won't go and do it again. But again, I think if you want to get at China, there's better ways to do it than through what's happening now.
Yeah, possibly, but maybe it's because they don't feel they have that. Remember about 3 4 years ago, even when Obama was in power, you thought like, ooh, there might be a standoff in the around these islands that China is manufacturing, and like, well, they just went past Taiwan on their first carrier, like. I guess that didn't happen. Like there was all this pivot to China. We're going to pivot to China. Um, yeah, I mean, this is like trying to start off, a gayer version of the alt-right revolution in Hong Kong. Really, like, wait? Are you saying all the Lady MAGA right wingers support the Hong Kong protests? It's just that you can tell that they're just trying to capitalize on this, the Mike Cernovich level of rightism. Like it's just so, it's just this very weak libertarian type of right wingism, that like is so cringy.
Yeah, that not even the people who believe in it actually believe in it. But yeah, again, I avoid talking about this subject because beyond major events, I mean, I think we spent more time talking about China's time in the Taiwan Strait than we did about these Hong Kong protests beyond just complaining about them. They're completely uninspiring, and I don't think anyone cares. Now, I will say this Hong Kong did report that they had an economic downturn. Germany reported 0.1% economic growth, which means they're probably fudging the numbers, and that Germany's
Yeah.
probably finally entered a recession. So we could be going into the new decade on the verge of a recession. I mean, again, we're seeing it here. Hong Kong, one of the major things about them, like yes, they're de facto a city state, but they are a pretty significant economy. Not enough to send the world into a recession, but if they're having an economic downturn, regardless of the protests, any of the politics going on right now, that probably doesn't bode well for the rest of the world. That's all I have to say in closing.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, having Western liberals and Western conservatives agree to back the protests, because of course the protests are, whatever Western channel you're looking at, they're basically showing them in a empathetic way. It is generally, you could argue from a Western perspective that it's generally neutral, especially compared to the way they're covering um, the impeachment trials, uh, or the impeachment hearings. So, but it's generally speaking, they're on the side of the protesters. And for me, anytime I see media do that, I think this is why I think that um, the left does want this to happen. You know, um, yeah,
Yeah,
and I think Trump does too, because I think he feels he can use this as leverage for trade deals, just as much as the left, but for opposite, in opposite directions. If you understand what I mean.
yeah, I can definitely respect the more Trump type realpolitik behind this, where like, yeah, you're going to use it as a wedge. It's not that you have any ideological inclinations towards this. Just like, oh, that's convenient. But again, that's all I really have to say about this. Nothing I've really haven't said before, and
Yeah.
uh, still good. I guess say calm topic to close the show out on. Now, I think that does it for me. Unless you have anything else to say.
No, that's about it for me.
Now, this has been, of course, another episode of the War Report. Hopefully, this one pans out with the premiere, and I don't have to just upload it. But last episode got decent views, so thank you everyone for watching that episode. Thank you everyone for watching this episode. We will see you next week, and goodbye.